Imagine your skin turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow, your eyes bloodshot, and then comes the black vomit, a terrifying torrent of digested blood that signals the end is near. In 1793, this wasn't a script from a horror movie. It was reality in Philadelphia, the bustling, temporary capital of the United States. A mysterious plague swept through the city, an unseen killer that stalked the streets, forcing the new federal government to flee and leaving thousands to die. Doctors were baffled. Chaos reigned. Friends started avoiding friends, and the dead were left abandoned in their own homes. This is the true story of the yellow fever epidemic that brought a new nation to its knees and exposed the fragile foundations of a society grappling with its own identity. It's a story of fear, of catastrophic failure, but also of incredible heroism in the face of a terrifying, unknown enemy. The trouble began, as it so often did, right at the docks. In early August 1793, a stream of refugees arrived from the French colony of Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti, fleeing political turmoil and a slave rebellion. These ships brought desperate people, but they also carried an invisible and deadly passenger. We now know the culprit was the Aedes aegypti mosquito, a species that thrives in cities, breeding in small containers of standing water. Carried in the water casks of those ships, infected mosquitoes began to multiply in Philadelphia's hot, humid climate. Soon, a strange and terrifying illness started popping up in the boarding houses along Water Street. At a house run by a man named Richard Denny, lodgers fell violently ill. The symptoms were unlike anything local doctors had seen. It started with chills, a high fever, and excruciating muscle pain. Then came the most horrifying signs. The victim's skin and eyes would turn a ghastly yellow as their liver failed. In the final, agonizing stage, internal bleeding would cause them to vomit a black, gritty substance that looked like coffee grounds. It was digested blood, a near certain sign that death was imminent. In the first few days of August, several people in and around the Denny boarding house died this way. At first, these deaths were just a curiosity, confined to the city's poorer waterfront district. But the disease didn't stay confined for long. On the 19th of August, after seeing a disturbing number of patients with these symptoms, Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of Philadelphia's most famous physicians and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, made a chilling public announcement. An epidemic of bilious-remitting yellow fever had taken hold of the city. The alarm was sounded, but no one could have comprehended the nightmare that was about to unfold. The city's doctors, considered among the best in North America, were utterly baffled. The germ theory of disease was still nearly a century away, and the role of mosquitoes was completely unknown. With fear spreading faster than the fever, Philadelphia's medical community fell into a bitter and public civil war. The question was simple: where did this plague come from, and how could they stop it? The doctors split into two factions, and their disagreement would have deadly consequences. One group, the Contagionists, often sided with the Federalist political party. They believed the fever was a foreign import brought to the city by the refugees from Saint-Domingue. Led by men like Alexander Hamilton, they argued for strict quarantines and closing the ports. Their theory was simple: the disease was contagious, like smallpox, and isolation was the only answer. On the other side were the miasmatists, championed by the formidable Dr. Benjamin Rush, and often associated with the pro-French Republican Party. Rush furiously disagreed that the fever was contagious. Instead, he insisted it was caused by a miasma, bad air, rising from local filth. He pointed his finger at a pile of rotting coffee left on a wharf, arguing its putrid fumes had poisoned the atmosphere and spontaneously generated the disease. For Rush, The answer wasn't quarantine, but sanitation. Clean up the city to purify the air. This medical debate wasn't just academic, it was deeply political. Federalists used the fever to stoke fears about French revolutionary ideals and immigration, while Republicans like Rush used it to call for civic improvements. And while the doctors argued, the invisible killer continued its silent march through the city. Dr. Rush, a man of unshakable conviction, wasn't one to just sit back and theorize. Convinced he was fighting a disease of internal inflammation, he developed a radical and aggressive treatment. His cure involved massive bloodletting and violent purging. Rush believed that by draining huge quantities of blood, he could reduce the body's inflammation. At the same time, he prescribed heavy doses of calomel, a mercury-based compound, and halap to make patients vomit and purge everything from their system. Rush worked with a feverish intensity, seeing up to 100 patients a day, and claiming his methods were a miracle. Many of his colleagues, however, were horrified. They argued his heroic measures were actually harming patients, weakening their bodies when they most needed strength. One French doctor, Jean Devez, who had seen yellow fever in the Caribbean, called Rush's approach a scourge more fatal to the humankind than the plague itself. Devez and others argued for gentler treatments, rest, fresh air, cold baths, and fortifying drinks. But in the rising panic, Rush's dramatic, aggressive approach gained followers. People were desperate for a cure, any cure, and the confident Dr. Rush seemed to offer one. It was a tragic choice, as his treatments likely added to the mounting death toll. Philadelphia in the summer of 1793 had already begun to sweat under the heat of its own ambition. Streets were crowded, the wharves alive with the sound of sailors unloading cargo, and the homes of the prosperous glowed with the energy of commerce. Yet beneath the bustle of what many considered the finest city in the young United States, a creeping dread began to coil itself around the people. The sickness, once a whisper, had started to show itself in too many places to ignore. What had begun as a handful of strange and frightening deaths was now a pattern, a rhythm, an undeniable shadow stretching from one neighborhood to another. At first, residents tried to carry on with their lives. Markets remained open. Bells rang from churches. Tavern owners filled mugs of ale and tried to reassure nervous patrons that this strange fever would pass as quickly as it came. But bodies told a different story. A man who had seemed perfectly well in the morning would collapse by evening, his skin burning with a relentless heat. Neighbors who had waved to him just days before now whispered that they would not dare step near his door. The city, once so sure of itself, now trembled with a fear that could not be easily contained. The cries of grief began to rise above the usual sounds of commerce. A mother would be seen clutching her child one day, and the next the child would be gone, carried out by hurried men with covered faces. Horses pulling carts rattled down the cobblestones, carrying not goods but coffins. People began to shut their shutters tightly even during the day. Some refused to leave their homes altogether. The once vibrant hum of Philadelphia life grew quieter, interrupted now and then by the heavy silence of streets where no footsteps sounded. Merchants debated whether to keep their doors open, torn between profit and safety. Some boldly declared that the fever was nothing more than common illness exaggerated by gossip, but as more clerks and shopkeepers fell ill, these words rang hollow. At the docks, sailors refused to unload certain ships. Rumors spread that the disease had come from the West Indies, carried by cargoes of sugar and coffee. Others muttered that it was punishment for sins, a scourge sent to remind the people of their mortality. And as fear spread, reason seemed to recede, replaced by suspicion, by whispers, by avoidance. Doctors argued bitterly among themselves. Some insisted the fever was caused by bad air rising from rotting vegetation near the wharves. Others swore it spread from person to person. Still others believed it was a test of divine judgment, something no earthly science could hope to explain. These debates did little to calm the frightened residents. Instead, they fueled confusion. Citizens wanted certainty, but certainty was impossible. Every family asked themselves the same question in hushed tones. Should they stay or should they flee? Fleeing was not so simple. To leave meant abandoning businesses, abandoning homes, abandoning neighbors. Yet the trickle of departures soon turned into a steady stream. Families with means packed carriages and left for the countryside. Those without such wealth looked on in bitterness, watching as wagons rolled out of town carrying trunks and barrels filled with supplies. The poor remained, trapped in crowded alleys where sickness spread most easily. In this way, the city began to divide, not only by fear, but by class. In the middle of this, the government itself faltered. Philadelphia was the temporary capital, and important men of the new nation walked its streets. But as officials and clerks fell ill, even leaders began to vanish. The machinery of politics slowed to a crawl. The halls of government that once buzzed with debate grew empty, abandoned by those who fled to protect themselves. A capital city without its leaders felt like a body without a heartbeat, and the citizens noticed. Their sense of order, already fragile, wavered further. Churches tried to provide comfort. Ministers gave sermons about faith, repentance, and endurance. Bells tolled more often now, not for celebration but for funerals. The ringing became part of daily life, a somber reminder of how quickly the fever claimed its victims. Families prayed, sometimes together, sometimes alone, asking for mercy or for understanding. But prayer did not stop the carts from rolling down the streets at night, carrying away the dead in increasing numbers. Children, who once played in the lanes and alleys, now stayed indoors. Their laughter disappeared, replaced by whispers behind closed shutters. Parents tried to distract them with stories, with chores, with any small diversion. But even the young could sense the heaviness pressing over the city. They too knew something terrible stalked the streets. Philadelphia trembled not only with sickness but with silence, the silence of empty taverns, of abandoned government chambers, of shuttered shops. Yet beneath this silence was the sound of fear, invisible but powerful. Every cough drew suspicion. Every pale face drew stares. People avoided one another, as though even the smallest contact might bring death into their homes. Loneliness settled in as firmly as the fever itself. Doctors began to test remedies. Bleeding, purging, blistering, all the painful methods of the age were tried again and again, often weakening patients further. Some believed in the power of mercury to drive out sickness, dosing their patients until their mouths burned with sores. Others gave mixtures of herbs, teas, and powders, praying for some relief. Families clung to any hope, no matter how desperate, but most found the same ending. The fever was stronger than the tools of medicine. As the weeks wore on, the city seemed to stagger under an invisible weight. Commerce slowed. Ships avoided the port. Letters carried news of the plague far beyond the city, spreading fear in other towns and states. Philadelphia, once a proud example of progress, now became a warning. It was not simply a local disaster. It was a crisis that touched the identity of the entire young nation. Still, amid the trembling, there were sparks of courage. Nurses who tended to the sick despite the danger, neighbors who carried water to those too weak to fetch it themselves. Grave diggers who performed their grim work with quiet endurance, heroism did not always shine brightly. Sometimes it appeared as a single gesture, a loaf of bread left at a door, a note slipped under a shutter, a whispered prayer offered beside a sickbed. These small acts of compassion glimmered faintly against the overwhelming fear, like stars barely visible behind storm clouds. The city trembled, but it did not yet collapse. People clung to hope in fragile ways. Some believed the fever would break when the weather turned colder. Others believed prayer would eventually turn divine wrath aside. Each day was endured with the thought that tomorrow might bring relief. Yet tomorrow brought more bells tolling, more carts rattling down the streets, more silence where once there had been life. In this way, Philadelphia lived in suspension, caught between its past vigor and its uncertain future. The tremble of fear became the rhythm of its days. It was a waiting, a dreadful waiting, where every hour might bring news of another death. The city, proud capital of a nation barely born, now stood like a patient itself, fevered, trembling, and uncertain of survival. As the fever tightened its grip on Philadelphia, the city began to change shape in ways both visible and invisible. The most striking transformation was the steady outflow of people. At first, only a few families had chosen to leave, cautious merchants or wealthy citizens who could afford country estates. Their departure was noticed, but not yet resented, for in every summer season it was common for the prosperous to retreat from the heat and humidity. Yet as the fever deepened its hold, this annual migration became something far more desperate. The act of leaving was no longer a simple matter of comfort, it was survival. Carriages rattled along the cobblestones at dawn, packed with trunks, bedding, and hastily gathered supplies. Horses strained under the weight, drivers whipped them hard, and passengers inside sat in silence, peering anxiously from behind curtains. Families carried only what they could, leaving behind homes that had been furnished with pride, businesses built over decades, even the possessions of ancestors. Neighbors watched these departures with mixed feelings. Some envied the chance to flee, others muttered bitterly that the wealthy abandoned the poor to die. Whatever the opinion, the effect was the same. The city streets grew emptier with each passing day. Not all who fled did so in comfort. Some walked on foot along the dusty roads leading to Germantown, to Chester, to farmlands that seemed safer simply because they were not Philadelphia. Entire households trudged together, fathers leading, mothers carrying infants, children trailing with bundles slung over shoulders. Wagons filled with the belongings of artisans clattered over bridges, their drivers glancing nervously at anyone who coughed. Along these roads, inns grew crowded with refugees seeking rest. Farmers looked uneasily at the swelling numbers of strangers who arrived at their doors. Fear traveled with the exiles. Villages outside the city were not eager to welcome them. Rumors spread that the fever clung to clothing, that it hid in blankets and linens, that it seeped from the very breath of the sick. Many towns set up guards along the roads, turning back travelers who could not prove their health. Signs were posted declaring that no one from Philadelphia would be permitted to settle within their boundaries. In some cases, wagons were forced to camp along the roadside, their occupants shunned by locals who refused to sell them bread or water. To be from Philadelphia in that season was to carry a mark of suspicion as heavy as the illness itself. The exodus was not only of families but of institutions. Government offices closed as clerks and officials fled. The city that had been the stage for debates about liberty and law now stood nearly abandoned by those who had sworn to serve it. Leaders of the new republic retreated to safer ground, their absence noted bitterly by those who remained. The sight of official carriages rolling out of town reminded the common people that even the structures of authority were fragile in the face of pestilence. Merchants shuttered their shops. The great warehouses along the river grew quiet, their doors locked, their goods left untouched. The ringing of blacksmiths ceased as apprentices deserted their masters. Taverns that had once overflowed with laughter and debate now sat empty or locked. Even the markets, once the pulsing heart of daily life, saw their stalls abandoned. Farmers hesitated to bring produce into a city marked by death. Those who dared demanded high prices for even the simplest food, knowing that desperation would pay what it must. In the absence of trade, hunger became another silent companion of the city. For those who could not leave, the exodus carried a bitter sting. To watch neighbors disappear was to feel abandoned. Streets that had once been filled with familiar faces now seemed haunted by absence. The poor, the enslaved, the laborers, and the widows were left behind, bound to the city by poverty or duty. Servants cared for houses whose owners had long since retreated to the countryside. Orphans wandered alleys that had once echoed with the footsteps of families. The city emptied, but it did not grow quiet. It echoed instead with the cries of those who remained. Among those who stayed were men and women who believed themselves bound by conscience or by profession. Doctors, nurses, clergy, grave diggers, and watchmen. They stood against the tide of departures, some out of duty, others because they had no choice. A few believed the fever would not touch them, that providence would protect those who labored for others. Many learned otherwise, their confidence swallowed quickly by the pitiless disease, yet their presence gave the city its last thin thread of order. Without them, Philadelphia might have dissolved entirely into chaos. The exodus also carried with it a strange silence. With every departure, the city lost a portion of its usual sound. The cries of children in play vanished. The hammer of carpenters, the rattle of carts, the debates in taverns all faded. The stillness that remained was broken only by the tolling of church bells for funerals, the rattling of death carts, and the low moans of the sick carried from shuttered windows. The absence of noise made the presence of death all the more pronounced. Yet there were moments when the departures created a false sense of calm. Streets once choked with traffic now seemed wider, emptier, easier to cross. For a brief instant, one might imagine the fever had simply erased the noise and left behind a quiet town. But the illusion never lasted. The smell of sickness drifted on the air, a heavy reminder that the emptiness was not peace but loss. Letters from those who had fled arrived sporadically, carried by couriers brave enough to travel between city and countryside. These letters often reassured loved ones that they were safe, though many were filled with unease. Refugees discovered that exile carried its own burdens. Some were refused lodging in towns they had hoped would shelter them. Others faced suspicion even among relatives. To be from Philadelphia was to carry not only the memory of danger, but the fear of contagion. In this way, the exodus spread the shadow of the fever far beyond the city walls. The people who remained in Philadelphia sometimes resented those who left. There was muttering that the wealthy valued their lives more than their city, that they abandoned the poor to suffer while they hid in the safety of their estates. The sight of grand carriages rolling out of town while common families huddled in narrow alleys deepened a sense of injustice. The fever had become not only a test of health, but of class. Survival was no longer only a matter of luck or providence, but of wealth and means. Despite this bitterness, the exodus did not stop. Each day brought new departures. Some families slipped away quietly, unwilling to attract attention. Others made hurried goodbyes, promising to return when the air cleared. By late summer, whole neighborhoods stood nearly empty. Houses locked, shutters closed, gardens untended, doors gathering dust. The city had become a shell of itself, its population scattered across the countryside, waiting in dread for word of when it would be safe to return. Those who remained grew used to the sight of emptiness. Streets once filled with the press of humanity now seemed strange and foreign. Grass sprouted between cobblestones in places where carriages no longer passed. Cats prowled unattended. The echoes of footsteps rang louder in the stillness. It was a city both familiar and alien, a place remembered but changed by absence. The exodus was not only physical but spiritual. Many who fled carried with them a sense of guilt for leaving behind friends and neighbors. Some wrote of their shame in letters, confessing that they longed to return but feared death too greatly. Others hardened themselves, convincing their conscience that survival excused abandonment. Yet for all, the act of leaving marked them. They were Philadelphians, yet in their departure they became outsiders, watching from a distance as their city withered. The fever created no easy answers. To stay was to risk death. To flee was to risk shame. In this way, every choice was a burden. Families debated late into the night, torn between loyalty to their homes and the instinct to survive. The city had become not only a battlefield against disease but against conscience, a place where every decision weighed heavy on the soul. The exodus of 1,793 was not written only in numbers but in absences. The absent friend at the market stall, the absent clerk in the office, the absent bell ringer whose silence marked more eloquently than words the loss of the city's heart. In these absences, Philadelphia felt the full measure of its trembling. It was not simply dying. It was hollowing. And yet, even in this hollowing, life continued in fragile threads. The milkman still made his rounds to the houses that remained occupied. Bakers still rose at dawn to make what bread they could. Mothers still hushed their children at night. Gravediggers still swung their shovels in weary rhythm. The city, though diminished, did not vanish. It endured, though with fewer voices to sing its songs, fewer hands to hold its burdens, fewer eyes to watch the dawn. The Exodus was both a retreat and a survival. It was a story of absence, but also a story of those who could not leave and those who chose not to leave. The city trembled, but it remained. And in the silence of its emptied streets, the fever spread still, indifferent to those who stayed or those who fled, indifferent to wealth or poverty, indifferent to hope or despair. Philadelphia waited, emptied and hollow, for what would come next. Silence is a sound in itself, and in Philadelphia during the autumn of 1793, it became the defining music of the city. A place that had once roared with commerce and chatter, with the hammer of smiths, the cries of market vendors, and the roll of wagons, now seemed to whisper only with echoes. The silence was not total, for life never fully halts, but it was heavy, oppressive, and unnatural. It weighed on those who remained like a blanket, muffling both hope and memory. The streets, once so alive, now felt like corridors of waiting. Philadelphia was not deserted, not yet, but with so many gone in the Exodus, and with so many others confined by sickness, the patterns of life broke apart. People no longer lingered outdoors, no longer greeted neighbors, no longer gathered in public squares. When figures did appear on the cobblestones, they moved quickly and alone, glancing nervously at every shuttered window, every cough that echoed from within a house. The once wide and welcoming avenues seemed narrowed by the absence of bustle. Buildings loomed like guardians over streets too quiet for comfort. The stillness was interrupted only by reminders of the fever. Bells tolled with mechanical regularity, each sound another mark of loss. Carts rattled by, pulled by weary horses, carrying the dead to hurried graves. Sometimes the carts moved by night, their wheels echoing in the darkness, the sound traveling farther through the emptied city than it ever could have in peacetime. Residents who lay awake in their beds listened to those wheels and counted them, wondering how many bodies they carried, wondering when the wheels would come for their own household. Silence settled also inside the homes. Families spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. Children, once noisy with games, sat listless, sensing the unease in their parents. Meals were eaten in quiet, sometimes no more than bread or broth if food could be found. Every creak of a floorboard, every knock at the door carried weight. The city had been turned into a place of waiting, of suspicion, of dread. People measured their days by what they did not hear, by who did not cough, by which neighbor's bell did not toll that morning. There were parts of the city where silence gave way to something more haunting. In poorer neighborhoods, whole rows of houses stood abandoned or sealed with boards across the doors. Grass grew high in alleys where no footsteps pressed it down. Cats roamed in packs, mewing in the dark. Rats grew bold, slipping across doorsteps in search of scraps. In these districts, silence was broken by the animal sounds of a city reverting to something feral. It was no longer the hum of human community, but the whisper of decay. The silence was not uniform. There were places where it broke into sudden noise, and these moments struck all the harder for their rarity. A scream from a window as another family member collapsed. The cry of grief from a woman carrying water who found her husband fallen in the yard. The clang of a church bell rung furiously to signal that yet another parishioner had died. These bursts of sound echoed for blocks, then faded, swallowed again by the stillness. Residents who heard them held their breath, as if making noise themselves might draw the fever closer. Doctors who remained in the city moved through these streets, their presence sometimes breaking the quiet but more often reinforcing it. The knock of a physician at a door was met with dread, for his visit meant illness already within. His departure, sometimes followed by silence, sometimes by weeping, left a heavier stillness behind. The city's doctors became ghostly figures themselves, passing like messengers of fate from one household to another, trailed always by silence when they left. Even the churches, once loud with hymns and sermons, grew subdued. Ministers preached to dwindling congregations, their words echoing off empty pews. Singing voices thinned until hymns were barely whispers. Some congregations closed entirely, their pastors too ill or too fearful to continue. Yet the bells still tolled, their heavy sound breaking the quiet but reinforcing its cause. The silence of prayer replaced the silence of commerce, but it was still silence, still heavy, still a reminder of loss. The streets themselves bore the marks of abandonment. Shops with shutters drawn tight, taverns with doors locked, their barrels of ale untapped. The great warehouses of the docks, once ringing with sailors' voices, stood closed and still. The port, usually a clamor of ropes and sails and shouting, had grown eerily calm. Ships avoided the harbor, fearful of contagion, and the few that remained lay silent at anchor, their decks empty. The Delaware River flowed past quietly, its steady current mocking the stillness of the city it bordered. In the midst of this silence, fear bred suspicion. A cough in the street caused others to recoil. A pale face drew stares and whispers. Neighbors who had once been friendly now avoided one another. Doors stayed shut, curtains stayed drawn. Some went so far as to nail boards across their windows, sealing themselves inside to wait out the plague in isolation. To see another human being was no longer a comfort but a risk. Solitude became a shield, silence a form of defense. And yet, silence had its own cruelty. It carried loneliness more sharply than any sound. Families cut off from neighbors, felt themselves adrift. The ordinary small connections of daily life, borrowing a cup of flour, exchanging a word on the street, greeting the butcher or the baker, vanished. People grew haunted by their own thoughts, by the stillness of rooms too empty of laughter. Children asked when they might play outside again, and their parents had no answer. Silence became a constant companion, one that wore away at hope with every passing day. Still, there were those who braved the quiet streets. Volunteers, many from the free black community of Philadelphia, walked the lanes carrying water, nursing the sick, and burying the dead. Their footsteps echoed where few others dared to go. They carried not only supplies, but also the faint sound of humanity back into the silence. Without them, the city might have fallen into complete abandonment. Their work, often unnoticed, wove a fragile thread of life through the stillness. For those who listened closely, silence itself carried its own lessons. It revealed what was missing. The absence of hammer and forge told of labor paused. The absence of market cries told of hunger creeping in. The absence of government debate told of leaders in flight. Silence was the mirror of the fever, showing the hollow spaces where life had once flourished. To walk through those streets was to measure not only the toll of death, but the toll of absence. The nights in Philadelphia were the most striking. Without the usual lamps lit in shops and taverns, darkness fell heavier. The moon cast its light on streets that were too empty, too still. Dogs barked in the distance, their calls unanswered. From time to time, the silence was broken by the slow roll of a cart bearing bodies to the burial grounds, the creak of its wheels echoing sharply. Residents lay awake, listening, counting, measuring the night by those sounds. Between them was silence, deep and pressing, a silence that seemed to stretch time itself. The silence was not permanent. Some days saw bursts of activity as neighbors ventured out for bread, as volunteers carried away refuse, as nurses moved between homes. But these were only interruptions, like ripples on a pond. The stillness always returned, heavier each time, as if the fever itself enforced it. The silence of Philadelphia in 1793 was not natural but imposed, a silence created by fear, by absence, and by death. And yet, within that silence, people endured. They sat at their tables and ate what little they had. They prayed in quiet rooms. They told stories in whispers to keep their children calm. They found ways to live inside the stillness, to hold on to the faint thread of ordinary life. The silence did not destroy them, though it weighed heavily. It shaped them, reminded them of their fragility, and taught them the strange endurance of waiting. Philadelphia's silent streets were not empty of meaning. They bore the weight of history. A city that had once declared liberty to the world now learned the lesson of vulnerability. Its silence was a pause in the rhythm of a young nation, a reminder that even in the proudest capital, life could halt with terrifying speed. The silence stretched on, marking not only the absence of sound, but the presence of fear. And in that silence, the city waited for the fever to relent, for the return of its people, for the day when its streets might again ring with life. Survival during the plague was never simple. To live through the fever was not only a matter of escaping the sickness itself, but also of enduring the endless weight of want, of worry, and of weariness. Each day in Philadelphia tested the patience of its people in ways small and large, wearing away at both body and spirit. The fever struck like a sudden storm, but survival was more like a slow erosion, a constant pressure that left no one untouched. Food became one of the greatest concerns. With markets disrupted, farmers reluctant to bring their produce into the city, and shops often closed, simple provisions grew scarce. A loaf of bread, once bought with ease, now became an object of anxiety. Families rationed what little they had, cutting thin slices, boiling scraps into thin soups, stretching meals so that a household might eat one day more. Salted meats dwindled, and fresh meat was nearly impossible to find. Milk spoiled quickly in the heat, and vegetables, when they could be purchased, were often wilted. Mothers worried constantly about their children, watching them grow thin, watching their eyes grow hollow. Hunger did not kill as swiftly as the fever, but it gnawed at the city all the same. Water, too, was a challenge. Wells remained, but many feared that sickness lurked even there, carried by unseen particles. Some boiled what they could, though fuel for fires was also scarce. Neighbors sometimes shared buckets, leaving them on doorsteps in the hope of avoiding direct contact. Water carriers moved through the streets, their footsteps echoing in the silence, their shoulders bent beneath heavy yokes. For their work they received small coins, but more often they received gratitude that words could not express. Cleanliness became nearly impossible. Streets filled with refuse as garbage collection faltered. The hot summer air turned this refuse into a breeding ground for stench, adding to the fear that bad air itself carried death. Families did what they could to scrub their homes, sprinkling vinegar, burning herbs, hanging cloth soaked in strong scents to ward off what they believed were poisonous vapors. The act gave them some comfort, even if it offered no true defense. Those who worked in care bore the heaviest strain. Nurses, many drawn from the free black community, entered homes that others dared not enter. They washed the sick, fed them what little food they could manage, and stayed by their bedsides even as the fever raged. Some of these caregivers fell ill themselves, but many endured, their efforts forming the fragile backbone of survival for countless families. Grave diggers, too, labored endlessly, their shovels striking soil again and again, their hands blistered, their backs bent. They carried not only bodies, but the invisible weight of sorrow that clung to every burial. Survival was also a matter of endurance against fear itself. Each cough, each ache, each chill brought dread. Was this the first sign? Families watched one another constantly, measuring the brightness of an eye, the color of a cheek, the strength of a voice. A stumble on the stairs could send a household into panic. Few slept well. Nights were long, filled with listening for sounds from neighbors, for the creak of death carts, for the tolling of bells. Dreams, when they came, were troubled by visions of sickness and loss. Work, for those who still had it, became both a blessing and a curse. Bakers, smiths, and shopkeepers who kept their doors open found themselves overwhelmed by both demand and risk. They labored without rest, fearful of contagion yet unwilling to let go of their means of survival. Many collapsed at their tasks, their shops closing not by choice but by necessity. For laborers and servants, survival meant continuing to work in households where sickness already dwelled. The strain of duty pulled against the strain of fear, leaving them weary in body and soul. Religion remained a refuge, though it too carried strain. Ministers urged their congregations to trust in divine providence, to repent, to endure. Yet even these ministers faltered. Some fell ill, some fled, some simply grew silent under the weight of so much grief. Those who remained worked themselves thin, preaching to half-empty churches, visiting the sick, burying the dead. Prayer circles formed in homes, whispered together by candlelight, families clutching one another as they asked for mercy. Faith sustained, but faith also demanded strength, and even strength could grow weary. Children bore their own strain, though they rarely understood it fully. They lived confined within houses, unable to play freely, unable to see friends, unable to roam the streets as before. Their energy turned restless, their laughter dimmed, their eyes watched the faces of their parents for cues of whether to fear. Some tried to make games of the silence, whispering to one another, drawing on scraps of paper, playing with shadows cast by candles. Yet even in their innocence, they felt the weight of survival. Their questions, simple and sharp, often carried more truth than adults wished to admit. When will it end? Why is the city so quiet? Why did our neighbor not come home? Survival also carried a burden of decision. Should a family stay or should they risk flight? Should they open the door to a neighbor in need or protect themselves in isolation? Should they seek help from a doctor whose methods might do harm as easily as good? Every choice was shadowed by uncertainty. No decision came without strain, for each path seemed lined with danger. Families argued, whispered, wept, and sometimes chose silence rather than face choices too heavy to bear. As weeks stretched on, the strain grew not lighter but heavier. Supplies dwindled further. Bodies weakened not only from fear, but from hunger, from sleeplessness, from constant anxiety. Even those who did not fall to the fever bore the look of illness: hollow cheeks, thin frames, weary eyes. The city itself looked weary, its walls grimy, its streets unkempt, its gardens overgrown. It was as though the very stones of Philadelphia sagged under the strain of survival. Yet within this strain there were sparks of endurance, families who shared what little they had with neighbors, women who baked extra loaves of bread to distribute quietly at night, men who risked their health to carry clean water to the elderly, volunteers who entered house after house without hesitation. Their strain was real, their exhaustion deep, but their will to help carried them through. In their actions, the city found its faint heartbeat. Survival was not only about enduring the fever, but about enduring together, even if together meant at a cautious distance, even if together meant only the silent leaving of food on a doorstep. The strain of survival also revealed strength in unexpected places. Children who learned to fetch water or tend fires when their parents weakened. Widows who took in orphans, adding to their burden but refusing to leave children adrift. Neighbors who sang hymns softly from porches to comfort those inside nearby houses. These small gestures did not erase the weight of survival, but they lightened it enough that hope did not vanish entirely. As the fever dragged into autumn, the city settled into a rhythm of strain. It was no longer a sudden shock, but a daily grind. Each morning brought the question of who had survived the night. Each evening brought the question of who might not see the dawn. People measured their strength in days, sometimes in hours, clinging to whatever fragment of normalcy remained. A cup of tea, a shared story, a moment of quiet laughter became treasures. Survival was never certain. Each household knew that the fever might still claim them. But in enduring hunger, fear, loneliness, and exhaustion, they carved out a space where life continued, fragile but present. The strain was immense, but it was also proof of resilience. Philadelphia strained, but it did not yet collapse. Its people strained, but they did not yet surrender. Survival itself became the city's greatest act, a slow defiance against the silence, against the sickness, against despair. And so the city endured, strained nearly to breaking, yet still alive. Its streets still whispered with footsteps, its bells still tolled, marking both loss and persistence. Its people still drew breath, each one a small victory. The fever had not passed, but the strain of survival showed that even in the darkest season, endurance remained possible. The late summer sun lingered over Philadelphia as if reluctant to leave, though the citizens could not share its warmth. By August and September of 1793, The city had become a place many no longer recognized. Its familiar bustle had dissolved into silence, broken only by the tolling of bells, the rumble of hastily built carts, and the occasional cry from within shuttered houses. What had once been the proud capital of a fledgling nation was now a city abandoned by thousands of its own people. The exodus became one of the defining features of the epidemic, reshaping the social fabric and leaving behind a ghostly landscape that would be remembered for generations. Leaving Philadelphia was not simple. Roads leading out of the city were crowded with carriages, horses, and on foot, ordinary men and women carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Families tied mattresses and trunks atop wagons, while others clutched small bundles carrying bread, blankets, and the most essential tools of survival. Along the Delaware River, boats filled with passengers set out for towns upstream, while ferries carried others toward New Jersey. For every wealthy merchant who left in comfort, dozens of poorer families trudged along dusty roads, seeking refuge in nearby villages or countryside barns. The decision to leave was not made lightly. Many feared abandoning their homes, their shops, or the sick relatives who could not make the journey. Yet the alternative was to remain within a city where each day brought more funerals. Reports of coffins running short spread quickly, and the sight of bodies placed outside for removal struck terror into households. Parents feared for their children, husbands for their wives, and neighbors for themselves. Fear outweighed loyalty, and soon even the bonds of friendship seemed fragile. Countryside towns at first accepted the refugees, but suspicion quickly grew. Villagers eyed newcomers with unease, worrying that the sickness traveled with them. Some towns erected barricades at their borders, refusing entry to anyone from Philadelphia. In New Jersey and Delaware, guards stood along roads to turn travelers away. Country inns denied lodging to those who admitted they came from the city. Even simple farmers, usually known for hospitality, began to shut their doors to strangers. Refugees who thought they had found safety often discovered themselves isolated once again, forced to camp in barns or open fields. The federal government had already fled earlier in the epidemic. Officials who had once filled the streets with business and conversation were now scattered across nearby states. The absence of leadership deepened the sense of abandonment. Without Congress, without the president, the city felt hollow. Local government officials did what they could, but many of them too left when their families demanded safety. Philadelphia became a capital without its leaders, a stage stripped of its actors, with only the ill and the brave remaining. Within the city, the emptiness grew more striking by the day. Market stalls once vibrant with sellers and customers now sat deserted. Shops closed their shutters, streets grew dusty, and grass began to sprout between cobblestones that usually echoed with the sound of horses' hooves. Even the Delaware waterfront, long a center of commerce, was hushed, with fewer ships docking each week. Sailors feared the disease and avoided a city rumored to poison all who entered. Those vessels that did arrive often faced crews who refused to disembark, forcing their captains to plead for labor or supplies. The absence of people changed the atmosphere in subtle ways. Silence became oppressive. Without the chatter of crowds, each cough or wail from within a closed house carried farther. Without the distraction of commerce, the sound of bells marking the dead grew more noticeable. Ordinary landmarks, like the courthouse or Christ Church, looked strange in their stillness. Even the air itself seemed altered, heavy with the odor of decay, carrying rumors of contagion that frightened those who remained. Those who could not or would not leave became witnesses to the city's transformation. Many were the poor, bound by lack of means or by obligation to employers. Others were caretakers of relatives too sick to travel. Still others were members of the Free African Society, clergy, or charitable individuals who chose to stay and help. Their presence gave the empty streets a fragile sense of life, but it was life under constant shadow. The city they inhabited was not the one they had known. Each day reminded them that Philadelphia was now a place reshaped by absence. Daily rhythms altered dramatically. Markets no longer bustled in the morning. Instead, the day's beginning was marked by the opening of burial grounds and the creak of carts bearing the dead. Afternoons brought few signs of normal business, though occasionally a physician could be seen moving hurriedly between patients, or a nurse carrying water and cloth. Children were rarely spotted outside, and when they were, they played quietly and close to home, their laughter subdued by fear. Evenings grew eerily still, punctuated only by dogs barking at shadows or the rattle of wheels carrying another body to the grave. Religious institutions, too, experienced the exodus. Some ministers fled with their congregants, leaving churches closed. Others remained, struggling to conduct services in thinly attended sanctuaries. Bells that once rang joyously on Sundays now tolled far more often for funerals. The silence within churches mirrored the silence outside, reminding survivors that the exodus had left even spiritual life diminished. For some, this deepened despair. For others, it strengthened resolve, encouraging them to rely on private prayer rather than public ceremony. The flight from the city raised questions about loyalty and responsibility. Many wondered whether it was honorable to abandon Philadelphia at its moment of greatest need. Critics accused those who left of cowardice, while defenders argued that protecting one's family was a moral duty. The debate mirrored the wider uncertainty of a young nation. Could Americans count on one another in times of crisis, or would self-preservation always come first? This question lingered over the Exodus, making it more than a physical movement. It became a moral test for individuals and communities alike. Travelers who left behind their homes sometimes returned weeks later, only to find those homes marked by neglect. Grass grew tall in yards, windows gathered dust. In some cases, looters had broken in, taking advantage of the empty streets. Other houses bore more haunting signs, doors locked tightly with silence within, or windows that revealed the still forms of those who had succumbed without ever being discovered. The city did not preserve itself in the absence of its people. Instead, it seemed to unravel, its very structures reflecting the toll of desertion. For those left behind, the exodus also created practical difficulties. With so many gone, shops closed, laborers absent, and transport scarce, survival became more challenging. Bakers, carpenters, and blacksmiths were suddenly few in number. Carters to remove bodies were overwhelmed. Nurses and doctors faced impossible workloads. Even water carriers, essential for households without wells, became scarce. The lack of manpower forced those who remained to take on unfamiliar roles, stretching their endurance and deepening their fatigue. The empty city also attracted comparisons to past plagues in Europe. Observers who stayed noted that Philadelphia resembled accounts of abandoned towns during medieval outbreaks, where fear drove people apart and silence replaced the noise of life. Writers who recorded their impressions spoke of wandering streets where only the sound of their own footsteps accompanied them. Some described Philadelphia as a city waiting for its own burial, hollow and unmoving, while the rest of the world looked on. Yet amid this emptiness, certain forms of solidarity survived. Volunteers organized to distribute food to households unable to provide for themselves. Members of the Free African Society continued to nurse the sick and bury the dead, often at great personal risk. A handful of clergy and physicians remained active despite exhaustion and grief. These individuals represented the opposite of exodus, a determination to stay, to endure, and to fight for the survival of their city. Their presence reminded those who stayed that Philadelphia, though diminished, was not entirely abandoned. As autumn deepened, the emptiness became almost unbearable. Trees began to shed their leaves, scattering them across deserted streets. Cool winds carried dust past shuttered houses. Each change in weather seemed to echo the city's decline. Those who walked abroad found themselves startled by the rare sight of another person, often exchanging brief nods before retreating into silence once more. Philadelphia had become a place where human contact itself was rare and thus precious. The exodus also reshaped the political memory of the epidemic. When later historians reflected on the crisis, they remembered not only the thousands of deaths, but also the flight of leaders and citizens. This absence became part of the story of the young nation, a reminder that even in times of collective identity, fear could scatter communities. The epidemic was not only a test of medical knowledge, it was also a test of loyalty, and in many cases that test revealed the limits of human endurance. The city had waited for relief through the long weeks of summer and autumn. Each day seemed to bring more funerals, more abandonment, more uncertainty about whether Philadelphia would ever recover. The air had been thick and heavy, carrying both the smell of decay and the dread of contagion. By October, those who remained in the city began to look to the sky, wondering if nature itself might provide the answer that physicians and human effort could not. When the first frost arrived, it was not merely a change of season. It was a turning point that marked the beginning of the epidemic's end. The appearance of frost on windows and rooftops in late October brought a sense of cautious hope. For weeks, residents had spoken quietly of the possibility that cold weather might drive away the sickness. Without understanding the true mechanism of yellow fever's spread, they clung to observations that heat and humidity worsened it, while cool air seemed to provide relief. When the chill came, it was greeted almost as a divine gift. People breathed more easily, feeling the air clear in their lungs. The fear did not vanish overnight, but for the first time in months, the city seemed to exhale. The number of new cases began to decline. Physicians who had been overwhelmed for so long noticed that their visits grew fewer each day. Burial grounds, once filled with the constant arrival of bodies, now saw a slower pace. Bells that had tolled without rest finally rang less often. This shift was subtle at first, easily missed by those still grieving or caring for the sick. Yet by early November, it became undeniable. The fever was loosening its grip. The death carts rattled less frequently over the cobblestones, and the dreadful stillness of the city began to lift, little by little. Survivors noticed other signs of recovery. Shops that had been shuttered for months creaked open once again. Bakers returned to their ovens, filling the streets with the smell of bread that had been absent for too long. Farmers began to bring produce into the city, restoring life to the marketplaces. Children emerged cautiously from their homes, their voices timid but growing stronger as they tested the safety of play once again. The frost did not erase the memory of what had happened, but it marked the point at which the living began to reclaim their city. For those who had fled, news of the epidemic's decline spread quickly. Refugees in nearby towns and farms heard rumors that Philadelphia was safer. At first, only a few families dared to return. Their wagons creaked along roads lined with fallen leaves, carrying them back to a place many feared they might never see again. As these families settled in, they reported that the sickness seemed to have vanished with the cold. Soon, others followed. By mid-November, streams of carriages, carts, and pedestrians were making their way back, reversing the exodus of earlier months. The city that had emptied itself in terror now began to refill. The return was not triumphant. Those who came back were met with silence and absence. Streets once familiar were marked by houses with blackened windows, homes where entire families had perished. Grass grew high in some yards, and weeds climbed the steps of neglected shops. Buildings that had once echoed with laughter and trade now stood vacant, their owners gone forever. The living found themselves surrounded by the reminders of death, a haunting landscape that made clear the scale of what had been lost. Families returning to their homes often discovered scenes they could scarcely bear to face. Dust-coated rooms left untouched for months. In some cases, doors had been forced open, belongings stolen by opportunists. In others, furniture lay undisturbed, but silence revealed that no one had survived within. The joy of return mingled with grief, for each household carried memories of neighbors who had not lived to see the frost. Philadelphia was still their city, but it was a city profoundly changed. Religious services resumed, though they were often filled with mourning rather than celebration. Ministers led prayers for the dead, their words carrying the weight of months of suffering. Congregations were thinner, with empty pews marking the absence of those who had succumbed. Yet for those who gathered, the act of worship was itself a form of healing. Bells rang once again, this time not for burials alone, but to call the living back together. In the sound of those bells, the city found a fragile sense of renewal. The frost also revealed the limits of medical understanding. Physicians who had argued fiercely over treatments now faced the reality that the epidemic had ended not through their efforts, but through the change of season. The debates between purging, bleeding, and gentle remedies seemed less urgent when nature itself had brought relief. Some continued to claim credit, pointing to their methods as the reason for survival among their patients. Others admitted quietly that the frost had accomplished what no medicine could. This recognition shaped the city's memory of the epidemic, reminding survivors of the power of nature beyond human control. As winter settled in, Philadelphia began the slow process of recovery. Markets reopened more fully, carters and craftsmen returned, and the rhythm of daily life gradually resumed. Yet the city was smaller than it had been. Estimates suggested that around 5,000 people had died, a staggering number in a population of little more than 50,000. Nearly 1 in 10 had been lost. This proportion left deep scars in families, neighborhoods, and institutions. Every block seemed to bear some absence. Every trade or guild found itself diminished. The social divisions revealed during the epidemic did not disappear with the frost. Questions remained about those who had fled and those who had stayed, about the conduct of physicians, about the sacrifices of the free African society, and about the flight of the government. These questions would echo in pamphlets, sermons, and conversations for months and years afterward. The frost had ended the sickness, but it had not resolved the debates it had ignited. The pestilence had left behind not only grief, but also conflicts that would shape the city's memory for generations. Still, there was a sense of resilience in the act of resettling. Children once again chased one another through the streets. Merchants reopened their ledgers, recording new transactions. Ships returned to the Delaware River, their sails bright against the pale winter sky. Slowly, the hum of life returned, though quieter, as if chastened by what had passed. Philadelphia had been brought to its knees, but it had not been destroyed. The frost had given it a chance to rise again, though forever altered. The cold months that followed served as a kind of healing period. Families gathered closely indoors, cherishing survival. Stories of the epidemic were told by candlelight, often in hushed tones. Parents explained to children why friends were missing from their games, why neighbors were no longer seen. Communities came together to provide for widows and orphans, offering food, shelter, and companionship. Out of tragedy grew a kind of solidarity, though one tinged with sorrow. Even as life resumed, there lingered a constant fear of return. People wondered if yellow fever would strike again when summer came. Each warm day in the following spring carried unease, as if the air itself might hide the seeds of another disaster. The memory of 1793 could not be easily forgotten. Though the frost had saved the city once, no one could be sure it would do so again. Philadelphia had entered a new stage of existence, one where the cycle of seasons carried with it the possibility of renewed dread. The frost and the fading pestilence became the turning point by which the epidemic was remembered. It was the moment when death began to retreat and life cautiously returned. Yet it was also a reminder of how fragile human communities remain before the forces of nature. The city had endured, but at great cost. Its recovery was not a return to what had been, but the beginning of something new, shaped by loss, resilience, and the memory of silence. When the frost settled over Philadelphia in late 1793 and the fever's grip loosened, the city was left to reckon with what had passed. The pestilence did not merely vanish with the cold. Its memory lingered in households, in neighborhoods, in institutions, and in the very spirit of the new nation. The epidemic had reshaped the way people looked at one another, the way they understood government, the way they thought about medicine, and the way they measured human endurance. Even after the streets filled once more with wagons, laughter, and trade, a shadow stretched across the city. It was the shadow of memory, heavier than frost, more lasting than silence. The dead could not be forgotten. Each family carried its own story of loss. Some households had lost parents, others children, others entire branches of kin. In neighborhoods across the city, vacant houses stood as stark reminders of those who had not survived. Funeral records bore witness to the sheer numbers, but it was in the empty chairs at dinner tables, the missing voices in workshops, and the unused tools left behind that the toll was most deeply felt. Philadelphia had lost thousands, and though the city would rebuild, those absences would never be filled. The city's institutions also bore scars. Churches, once bustling with congregants, now counted pews half empty. Trade guilds had fewer members. Schools mourned the loss of teachers and pupils. The very rhythm of civic life felt altered, as though the city itself walked more slowly, carrying the weight of what it had endured. The national government, having fled during the crisis, returned to a capital that looked familiar but felt changed. Trust had been shaken. The question of whether leaders could be counted on in moments of fear had become part of the nation's earliest political memory. The medical community faced its own reckoning. Physicians who had prescribed aggressive purges and bleeding stood firm in their belief that their treatments had saved lives, while others argued that gentler remedies or simple rest had proved more effective. The truth was hidden by the mystery of the disease itself, which no one yet understood. Yellow fever would not yield its secrets for another century, and so the debates of 1793 lingered unresolved. What remained clear was that medicine alone had not ended the epidemic. Nature, through the turn of seasons, had played the decisive role. This humbled many and sowed doubt in others, leaving the city wary of grand claims of cure. Amid this uncertainty, the Free African Society stood as an enduring example of courage. Members of the society had nursed the sick, carried the dead, and shouldered burdens that many others would not. In the aftermath, their contributions were both celebrated and challenged, with critics questioning their motives or accusing them of profiting from tragedy. Yet the deeper truth was that countless lives had been sustained by their labor and compassion. Their role in 1793 became part of the complex fabric of Philadelphia's history, a reminder of both prejudice and resilience. For ordinary citizens, the epidemic left lessons etched in daily memory. Some learned to distrust crowded gatherings, fearing contagion might strike again. Others placed greater faith in prayer, convinced that survival had come through divine mercy. Families who had fled carried guilt or relief, depending on whether their choice had spared or abandoned loved ones. Those who had stayed bore the mark of exhaustion, but also a quiet pride in endurance. Across the city, the experience of 1793 became a story told to children, a story retold by survivors, and a story remembered in whispers whenever summer heat returned. The physical city also reflected the past. Burial grounds expanded, with rows of fresh graves marking the year's devastation. Records were kept and memorials raised, though most of the dead lay in simple plots, their names fading on weathered markers. Streets that had once echoed with death carts gradually filled with commerce again, yet to those who had witnessed the emptiness, each familiar place carried two layers of meaning. A market was not only a place of bread and trade, it was also the place where silence had once been absolute. A church was not only a place of prayer, it was also where bells had tolled endlessly for the departed. The epidemic shaped how Philadelphia saw itself in relation to the wider nation. As the temporary capital of the United States, the city had been a symbol of unity and ambition. In 1793, it had become a symbol of fragility. The federal government had fled, revealing how quickly fear could scatter even the highest leaders. For many Americans, the story of Philadelphia's plague became a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of cities and the uncertainty of progress. The nation was young, its institutions still fragile, and yellow fever had reminded all that human hopes could be humbled in an instant. And yet, out of tragedy came resilience. Philadelphia did not collapse. Its citizens returned. Its markets revived. Its role as a center of politics and trade endured, even if scarred. The epidemic became part of the city's identity, a chapter in its story that could not be erased. For generations afterward, Philadelphians would speak of 1793 as a year of terror, but also as a year that proved the city could endure catastrophe. The memory was painful, but it was also a source of endurance, shaping the way the city faced future trials. The long winter following the epidemic brought time for reflection. By hearth and candlelight, survivors told their stories. They spoke of the day they first heard the bells tolling, of the moment they saw neighbors fall ill, of the silence that descended as the exodus began. They spoke of the smell of decay, of the cries of the sick, of the exhaustion of those who worked without pause. They spoke of frost on windows and the relief it brought. In these retellings, the epidemic became not only a memory of horror, but also a reminder of survival. When spring came again in 1794, unease returned with it. Every warm breeze carried the question of whether the fever would rise again. The city's residents lived with that uncertainty for years, as yellow fever outbreaks recurred, though never again with quite the same scale of devastation. The fear lingered, shaping behavior, shaping policy, shaping memory. Philadelphia remained a place of ambition and growth, but always shadowed by the recollection of its most silent season. In the centuries since, the epidemic of 1793 has been studied, retold, and remembered as one of the defining crises of early America. It revealed the limits of medicine, the fragility of government, the power of nature, and the endurance of ordinary people. It exposed division, but also inspired acts of courage. It was a tragedy measured in thousands of lives, but it was also a story of survival measured in the resilience of a city that endured. As the frost fades into memory and the years move forward, the story of Philadelphia's plague remains more than a chapter of history. It is a reminder of the thin line between order and chaos, between life and loss, between hope and despair. It reminds us that cities are living things, dependent on the people who fill them, vulnerable to forces beyond their control, yet capable of renewal. Philadelphia in 1793 suffered deeply, but it did not vanish. Its scars became part of its identity, and its endurance became part of its strength. And so, when we look back on the epidemic, we are not only remembering the dead, we are also remembering the living, those who carried on in the face of fear, those who cared for strangers, those who rebuilt a city emptied of life. Their memory lingers in every retelling, reminding us that even in silence, even in absence, there is always the possibility of return. Thank you for listening to this long, quiet story of Philadelphia's yellow fever plague. If you found calm in this history, consider subscribing so you can join me for more slow journeys into the past. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and may your dreams be peaceful and free of restless shadows. Good night.